are people that do like to set themselves the challenge of reading and finishing a book in English. It's seen as the ultimate thing to overcome, like it's something really difficult. Like if you can read a book in another language, then that means that you've mastered it. And while that might be true for some books, I don't really think that that is true for all books, and you can definitely read a book without being fluent, proficient, whatever. And actually reading is a really good way to get you there. There's a sense of satisfaction that finishing a book gives us in whatever language, the feeling of reading the last few lines, closing the book and thinking, I read that, and I read that in English. Most people never get to that point, and I can include myself in that. I normally buy books as a hobby, and I buy books, but I never actually finish reading them. So if you're one of those people too, or you just really want some tips on how to read and finish a book, then these are my recommendations for you. So the first half of these recommendations are going to be more focused on picking or selecting, choosing the book, and the second half of my recommendations are going to be more focused towards reading strategies and techniques. So if you want to skip to a part of the video that you think will most help you, then you can do that now. Okay, so this is not really like part of the first recommendation. It's kind of a preface to the whole video, that if you do not read already as a habit in your first language, then this whole thing is going to be a lot harder. Sometimes my students will come to me and they'll say that they want to finish a whole book in English, but they don't actually read habitually in their first language. This is really important because reading is a habit, and if we're not doing that in a language that is already easier for us, then it's going to be even more difficult in a language that is more foreign, literally. The first big mistake that people make when choosing a book is that they go for something that is way more advanced. No, I don't mean advanced. I mean, they did what I did. Don't be me. I bought Game of Thrones in Spanish, and it's just absolutely massive, a real chunk of a book, and it has so many words on the page, and also because it is like a fantasy book, there are so many words and phrases that are so specific to the world of Game of Thrones, and I just had a real hard time reading it because it was just more difficult, and I also had seen the series and I was less motivated to finish it. I shouldn't have bought something that was so big because I was never gonna finish it, especially as my first book. So my recommendation is to pick something that is way shorter, and what I mean by that is I'm going to split this into two things. First of all, we want to find something that is visibly shorter. For example, you can pick something shorter because it's just going to be easier and faster to finish, and you're just going to get that sense of satisfaction a lot faster than if you were reading Game of Thrones. Look at them. I could have read this, or books. I could have read like 5 books instead of this one. You don't have to be reading a massive novel or some great classic like Pride and Prejudice or whatever. You just pick something that is short and easy. Here are some examples of short, random books that I picked up. This one is like more like an erotica book. At least that's what I thought, Pasión Serena. But actually I would give it a 5 out of 10 because it wasn't as sexy as I thought it would be. It's more like the romance novels that my grandma used to read. And then this is another example. This is in English. I just bought this book because it was super cheap. I don't know if you can see it. Storms. And I also really loved all of the illustrations as well. There's not really that many words on a page. It's a science book, but it's more popular science, so it was super easy. I also read this in one afternoon. I also tried something a little bit more factual, which is about epidemics. So very varied, but if you notice, they're all sort of a similar size. Now, it's not just about it being visually smaller, the book itself, it's also about the format of the book. Of course, Game of Thrones is a novel, it's also part of a wider series, so it's not just about reading this book, it's about reading all of the other ones that come after it as well, and kind of having that pressure. To avoid kind of losing motivation because it's taking ages for us to read, what we can do is we can change the format of what we're reading. For example, you could read a collection of short stories, you could read a poetry anthology, you could also read a collection of essays, you could read something that's more in diary format. For example, we've got Che Guevara's Motorcycle Diaries. That's an example of the diary format. This one is a collection of essays on different feminist issues. This one is just a one essay book, very popular. We Should All Be Feminists. This is my favorite, and this is also one that I recommend to my students. It's called Poem for a Day. My aunt and uncle got me this one Christmas or one birthday, and honestly I think it has been such a great gift because you can just keep going back to it. It has a poem for every single day of the year, and often at the bottom of the page you can see it even comes with some extra background and information on the poem, the writer. If you don't have a lot of time, this is just a more practical thing for you to read, I guess. I also give my students birthday poems sometimes. So we've kind of discussed picking visually smaller or shorter books. We've talked about picking different formats that are more accessible instead of just going straight for long novels. The next thing is about word to page ratio. So basically, how many words are on each page. For example, this little one here, We Should All Be Feminists, doesn't really have that many words per page, but if we compare it with Juan Rulfo El Llano en Llamas, you can see that there are just so many more words on this page. Why is this important? Well, we get satisfaction and we get that hit of dopamine every time we turn a page. It's like a sense of achievement. We finish that page, we get to turn it over. If you are reading something like this, which has more words per page, then it's going to take you a lot longer to turn the page and therefore finish the book, which means less sense of achievement, less dopamine hits. If you want to go for something like this, it's going to be a lot faster and we're just going to feel better and get that sense of achievement faster. I would recommend starting with something like this, which has less words on a page, and then finally ending up with something like this, which has more words on a page. If you're already more advanced at reading or you have a higher level of English, you can maybe start with something like this, but then work your way up to something like Game of Thrones, or basically what I did not finish or read. My next piece of advice for choosing the book is to pick something new. For some reason, everybody seems to pick Harry Potter, and I totally get it. It is a classic, and you know, it's really nice to read something that we enjoy and that is familiar to us. But for me, it just never really worked because I wasn't that bothered what happened to the characters. In part because I'd already read them in English and I already knew what was going to happen. There was no real motive for me to keep reading, which is why I would personally recommend to read something that you have never read before, because it's going to be new. You're going to be hopefully hooked onto the story or whatever's happening and going to keep going. This is also where reading fact or fiction could affect motivation. It really depends on your interests. My last recommendation for picking the book would actually be choosing a bilingual edition or a bilingual version. So I've had bilingual versions of poetry anthologies, for example, where on one side of the paper it is in English and on the other side it is in another language. In my case, it was in Spanish because those are the languages that I was using at that time. But you can find bilingual editions of books and poetry anthologies, things like that, pretty much anywhere on the internet. But they are harder to find and sometimes they are more expensive. So what I did with Harry Potter is I already had my copy in English and then I just bought the copy in Spanish, and then I would sit with both books in my hand, one in English, one in Spanish. It was difficult when I wanted to turn over the page, but it is quite good if you want to just quickly go and check a word or a phrase that you're not quite sure of. Something that you can also do as well is just read the version in English, and then when you're not sure of a word, just quickly go to that chapter and that page in whatever version in your language. This is good because it means that you're not heavily relying on dictionaries and things like that. Books are heavy and they're also expensive, so I understand that buying 2 copies For some people won't make sense, for other people that will be their preferred strategy. Now you've picked your book, hopefully, so we're going to work on some reading techniques. Now these reading techniques aren't exclusive for just reading books. You can use these techniques for anything. Reading comprehensions, reading exams, whatever you like. So what we ask students to do whenever we're doing a reading task is first we will ask them to read for the general idea, and then we can ask them to read it again for more specific information. We can't read this book twice. I mean, you can if you have the time and patience. Me personally, I cannot do that. We'll just be reading for general ideas. My main advice to you is to not stop. Keep reading, even when you don't understand a word or an idea, or maybe the whole sentence, maybe the whole paragraph. Just keep going. Trust me, it will kind of get better, hopefully. Don't pressure yourself into thinking that you need to understand every single word. You don't know every single word. In your first language, nobody does, and that's a really unrealistic expectation. It's gonna take your brain a little bit to adjust, but the more you read, the less anxiety-inducing it will be, and also the less stressful it will be. In my opinion, the more that I've read, the less I think about how much do I understand this. When you stop asking yourself, do I understand everything? I think that's actually when you do start to understand. There are two techniques that are really useful for understanding the general idea. The first one is called a chapter review. A chapter review could be basically where you don't stop reading, you don't look up any words, you read the whole chapter, and then when you get to the end, you can do a chapter review. So at the end of every chapter, we are going to do a little summary and see if we can summarize what happened in each chapter in just one sentence. And we can use key questions like what, who, and where to get the main details like what happened, who was there, who were the main characters, where did this take place. We could maybe also ask things like when did it happen, why did it happen, how did it happen, and if we can summarize what happened in just one sentence, that's great. We can also use the chapter review technique for vocabulary as well. So instead of stopping every single time that you don't understand a word, what we're going to do is when we're reading through the book, we are going to use a pencil and we're going to underline keywords. If you don't like scribbling in books, and I know that some people are really particular about this, you don't have to underline anything. Once you've finished the chapter, go back and then look up the words. You could even make a little vocabulary list at the end of each chapter. I personally wouldn't recommend looking up every single word in a dictionary. If I don't know a word, I either use context to work it out or I don't even look it up at all. The only words that I focus on are repeated words. For example, there was this, where was it? There was a word in the first chapter that was just repeated over and over and over again. As soon as I finished the chapter, I went back, looked at all of the times that I had underlined it. Perseguido por los bramidos del júbilo del buque del obispo. So I kind of thought maybe it's something to do with a boat. Salió de su casa, varias personas corrían hacia el puerto, apremiadas por los bramidos del buque. And I was like, okay, so they were in a hurry by the something of the boat. And then it mentioned it again and it kept mentioning it. So I was kind of getting more context and I thought, does it mean steam? Does it mean some kind of noise? And that is basically what it meant. I tried to use context to work it out and more or less I was right. I mean, it was like the sound that these steamboats were making. So to get the general idea, we can do a couple of things. We can do the chapter review with vocabulary. We can also do it by summarizing the chapter in just one sentence. We can also search for a general idea by using what are called narrative tenses. There are three main narrative tenses. We've got past simple, past continuous, and past perfect. Each of these tenses has a slightly different job whenever we are telling a story. So this is mostly going to apply to fiction, maybe not so much to non-fiction, but who knows. We use the past simple when we are giving facts. We use the past continuous to add detail to the story. And then of course the past perfect, we use it to describe events that happened earlier in the past of the past. So here we've got an example sentence. I hadn't eaten breakfast before I left the house because I was running late. Here we can get the general idea of what happened just by focusing on the word that is in the past simple, which is I left or I left the house. That's the main idea of this part of the story and it's the most important important. If we look at the added detail, it's not necessary. I was running late, it's in past continuous. We don't necessarily need that information. We could just say, I hadn't eaten breakfast before I left the house. And if we were being really basic, we could just say, I left the house. The main message is still there. We don't need the extra information, but if it's there, it'll probably be in past continuous. Here we've got two past events. We know that one happened before the other because one is in the past perfect, the other is in past simple. You could easily say this sentence like, I didn't eat breakfast and then I left the house. That would be correct. Grammatically correct. You can also indicate time with this word before, but you can also indicate time and order with grammar. And so this is a great example of that. In essence, if you really want to understand the main message, just focus on the verbs in past simple. You don't need to pay attention necessarily to past continuous. You don't even really need to pay attention to past perfect, although it is giving you more detail about the order of events. My final piece of advice is that you should have a time limit. There's no point in just reading aimlessly with no structure, although if you personally respond to that, that is totally fine. I would recommend designating 30 minutes to an hour every single night before you go to bed to reading, and have the book right beside your bed so that it's a constant visual reminder. If you are more into ebooks, this is going to be a little bit harder, but totally possible. I prefer to have a physical book so that it's just this huge reminder right beside my bed that, oh, here's the book that you're reading, don't forget me, because I always forget about them. As soon as I move the book that I'm reading from my nightstand with my lamp to another place, that book is forgotten. I will never see that book again. I will never open it again. Have it there, have it where you can see it, because it's so easy to forget. You could also use like a habit tracker or some sort of reminder on your phone for a specific time so that it goes off and you'll remember to read. I hope that you're already starting to think of what book you could possibly read. If you've already got an idea, I would love to know what you've decided to read, and yeah, share it in the comments and continue the discussion there.